Chapter 1561. He nodded. Then she moved closer to his lips and kissed him, slowly moving downwards. The ecstasy was like a tsunami. He was like a pitiful young man who couldn't control himself. In the end, he still pulled her into his arms. He couldn't bear to do that to her. He kissed her lips pitifully. "Liangxiu, I won't do this to you." She giggled in his arms, her slender fingers poking at his heart. Her voice was filled with joy. "But I want to do this to you." Qin Anlin let out a long breath. This was killing him. He reached out and caressed her red lips. "Mrs. Qin, you've learned bad things." She chuckled softly and lay in his arms. She was especially happy. "I learned it all from you." He patted her little butt. "All right, time to get up." She was pregnant, so their honeymoon was only a week long, and it was in the country. However, for newlyweds, a week without children was also very precious, especially Qin Anlin. He couldn't wait to shove his son back into his wife's belly so that they could have a world of their own. He took her to the south, or rather, to the place she had been to for the past few years. Yi Liangxiu took him on the path she had taken before, brought him to eat her favorite food, and kissed him in the hotel suite at night. Even though they were an old married couple, there was still a different kind of romance when they were newlyweds. There was a lot of rain in the south during autumn. When it rained, they would quietly listen to music in the room and enjoy the rain outside. He would cook for her, take good care of her, and feed her well. Qin Anlin looked at the rain outside the window and looked down at his new wife in his arms. He smiled. "Liangxiu, I used to think that living a life of luxury was the only way for me in this life." He didn't expect that such a peaceful life could make him feel so satisfied. Even he couldn't do anything with her other than kissing and nibbling. Yi Liangxiu retreated a little and sat at his feet. She also looked at the drizzle outside and tilted her head to look at him. She smiled faintly. "Anlin, that's because you didn't touch me." He smiled and went over to rub her head. Then he dragged her over again. He pressed one hand on her shoulder and the other on her lower abdomen, feeling their little one. The little fellow was more than 3 months old. At this time, when he placed it on her lower abdomen, it actually moved a little. Qin Anlin was shocked. He raised his hand, and his gaze fell on her face. "Liangxiu, it moved. It's not like it's a little beast." But in Qin Anlin's heart, it was just a small animal, a wonderful little creature. Would it swim in Liangxiu's stomach? What would it look like? His expression was very silly, just like all the fathers in the world. Yi Liangxiu laughed. "Anlin, this is fetal movement. It's clearly the one moving." As Qin Anlin said this, he straightened her up and let her lean against the backrest. Then he lay on her belly. He felt that it wasn't good, so he lifted her clothes. This way, he wouldn't be able to feel the presence of the little fellow on her belly. Then he felt the little thing wriggle. Qin Anlin was extremely surprised. He looked up at Yi Liangxiu. "How can there be someone as silly as you? You already have a son." She placed her hand on his head and slowly scratched his scalp. Her expression was gentle. Chapter 1562. Qin Anlin couldn't help but laugh. "This is the first time I've felt it." He loved Mu Yun, but he seemed to like the little one in her belly even more. He had a feeling that it would be a little girl. He had been envious of Tang Yu's little heart for a long time. It must be fun to pinch such a chubby little thing. As he thought about it, he couldn't stop touching her belly and felt that he was more and more awesome. Tang Yu couldn't make Pei Chi-Chi's belly bigger again. Qin Anlin felt that he was about to ascend to the heavens. He chuckled and pinched his little wife's face. "Isn't my husband awesome?" Yi Liangxiu looked at him. Shameless. Qin Anlin was full of pride again. He trapped her in his arms and chuckled. "Tell me, isn't your husband awesome?" Yi Liangxiu was speechless. She pinched his cheeks and said, "Hubby, you're so awesome. Why didn't any of the women get pregnant?" Qin Anlin was a little confused. It didn't seem appropriate to say that. He reached out and pinched her cheeks again. "Did I? Where else could there be other women besides you? You still won't admit it?" She bit the tip of his nose, her eyes sparkling. He was a little dazed. After a long time, he leaned over and kissed her eyelids. He said gently, "Liangxiu, you don't know how much I love you." Yi Liangxiu glared at him. "That's not what we're talking about. But that's all I want to talk to you about." Qin Anlin looked at her. "You don't know how cute you are." She was actually not a cute girl. She was very tall and had a strong aura, but she would be cute in private. Yu Lianxiu looked at him. They're not as cute as your harem. He smiled. He especially liked when she was jealous. He rubbed her hair as if he was petting a little animal. They're not compatible with me. I can't get pregnant. As soon as he said that, she kicked him. Yu Lianxiu kicked him harshly. You still dare to say that? He chuckled. I like it when you're jealous. She kept quiet. Qin Anlin looked at her. Are you angry? She turned her face away and looked out of the window. You're angry. He laughed. How do you want to coax you? Although he said that, he still looked at her affectionately. She was wearing a loose white dress, and her long hair was let down. She was unspeakably ethereal. Her beauty needed to be savored slowly. Yu Lianxiu turned her head and looked at him. Do 100 push-ups. Qin Anlin smiled, jumped down from the window, and laid on the ground. He looked at her. Lianxiu, come up here. Yu Lianxiu looked at him and still sat on his back. Qin Anlin started doing push-ups. Only then did Yu Lianxiu know what an electric motor was. But he was so bad. He purposely made that embarrassing sound, as if he was doing that kind of thing. She covered her ears. He finished doing 100 push-ups in a short while. After that, he carefully took her off and turned over to look at her. Lianxiu, are you happy? Yu Lianxiu squatted down. I'm happy to see you tired. He kissed her. After giving birth, I made you tired every day. Shameless. She bit his lip. Pervert. Chapter 1563. She didn't need to wait until after giving birth to the child. She would feel tired from being pestered by him every day. After returning to B City, Qin Anlin brought her and little Mu Yun to live in the villa. Naturally, he also arranged security guards around to ensure her safety. Her prenatal checkup, if it didn't require the use of large equipment, was almost always done at home. Qin Anlin would send a car to invite Dr. Mei over and send her back after the checkup. This time was no exception. When he came back, Yu Lianxiu looked at him and hugged her knees. You've never sent me off like this before. Qin Anlin sat down and looked at her. He smiled. Then I'll take my little friend out to ZZ. His little friend was arrogant. I don't want to go out. She had been lazy since she came back from the south and didn't like to go out. However, he wanted to take her out to relax. At least, it would be easier for her to give birth after exercising more. However, she was really blessed by nature. Even though she ate so much and didn't exercise, she still had slender hands and feet. She was a natural clothes rack. If she wore loose clothes, no one would be able to tell that she was pregnant. Qin Anlin couldn't do anything about her clinging to him like this, but he still took her out no matter how hard he tried. It was an early autumn evening. The sunset was beautiful, and the scenery of the park was pleasant. Qin Anlin pulled his little girl with a doting look on his face. At first, Yu Lianxiu didn't want to go out, but now she was in high spirits. She sat by the lake with Qin Anlin and fed the fish. She wore a pair of white pants with Qin Anlin's light blue shirt. She was tall, so she looked surprisingly good in it. Her long hair was tied into a ponytail, which made her look especially elegant. Qin Anlin reached out and pulled her into his arms. He hugged her and accompanied her. Looking at her happy expression, he felt happy in his heart. After getting married, she would more or less think of Su Cheng and the lonely Kime. She couldn't let go of it. So, he wanted her to be happy. He gave her a marriage, not because he wanted her to be happy, but because he wanted his Lianxiu to feel happy because of him. Qin Anlin smiled and held her in his arms. His heart was indescribably soft. He hugged her and pressed his lips against the side of her neck. Look, there's a big fish there. He looks quite stupid. Anlin, he looks a bit like you. She chuckled. He glanced at her and reached out to smack her head. Nonsense. However, he soon laughed. If I were that fish, I would be quite stupid. Otherwise, why would I be fooled by you? Yu Lianxiu stared at him. He chuckled and coaxed her. All right, I'm a stupid fish. It was rare for her to be happy, and he didn't want to spoil her mood. Only then did she happily continue to throw bread to the little fishes. Suddenly, a figure appeared in front of her, blocking her line of sight. She looked up at the person in front of her. Unexpectedly, it was Su Shicheng with a nanny supporting him. The current Su Shicheng was completely different from the Su Shicheng 2 months ago. His face was yellow, and his figure was much thinner. He looked at the two people hugging each other, and a faint smile appeared on his face. His voice was also faint and gentle. Liangxiu. Yi Liangxiu stared at the man in front of her. She knew that he was sick. It seemed that he was really sick. She felt a little sad, but she wasn't sad. Chapter 1564. I waited for you here on purpose. Although Su Shirqing's face was scrawny, his expression was unprecedentedly kind. He slowly said, "You and Anlin didn't invite me to your marriage." His eyes fell on her belly, and after a while, he said softly, "The child is almost 4 months old." He smiled bitterly and coughed violently a few times. "I haven't prepared anything for her yet, so I can make up for it with your wedding." Yi Liangqiu's voice was a little stiff. "I don't need it." Su Shirqing's face was a little pale, and he looked a little embarrassed. His facial muscles trembled a few times, and then he said in a low voice, "It's a token of my appreciation." With that, he gestured to the nanny next to him, and the simple middle-aged woman handed a file bag to Yi Liangqiu from her bag. Yi Liangqiu was not willing to take it. "Take it. Consider it my atonement." Su Shirqing's voice was indifferent, as if he had seen through everything. "I have brought your mother back, and I will take good care of her in the future," he paused before saying. "In the future, when I am not here, you will take care of her." In Qin Amlin's arms, Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and couldn't say a word. Qin Amlin gently let go of her, squatted down, and picked up the file. "President Su, take it back. Liangqiu's ambition is not here." He didn't have to think about it to guess what was in the file. It was a hot potato. As expected, it was the shares of ATV. What tricks was Su Shirqing thinking? Su Shirqing looked at Qin Amlin and smiled slightly. "Amlin, she's my daughter. How do you know that her ambition is not here?" "Amlin is right." Yi Liangqiu's voice was cold. "I have no interest in ATV at all." Su Shirqing looked at her face and didn't get angry. He just said lightly, "Liangqiu, it's time to go home." His words would cause misunderstandings, especially from Qin Amlin. Yi Liangqiu looked at Qin Amlin. Seeing that his expression was normal, she felt relieved. She picked up the document and handed it to Su Shirqing. "Give up, I won't go back." She would never go back to that dark place again. Su Shirqing smiled faintly. "You don't want your mother anymore?" Yi Liangqiu looked at the person in front of her. He was so impeccable. Family, marriage, nothing could be his weakness. If he could do it, so could she. If her heart softened because of Mrs. Su, then she would have fallen into his trap. As for Mrs. Su, she would solve it through the Su family. Su Shirqing could not afford to offend the Su family now. So she said resolutely, "I never had the chance to choose." Su Shirqing was startled for a moment. Then he laughed lightly and coughed. "Liangqiu, you were just like your father, decisive and ruthless." After that, he looked at her deeply, took the bag, and left slowly. He walked slowly and coughed from time to time, like an old man who was dying. Yi Liangqiu stood there and watched for a long time. "Let's go back." Qin Amlin hugged her and then said with a relaxed expression, "The air here is not good. I won't come again." Yi Liangqiu grunted. She really didn't want to see Su Shirqing. After seeing him once, she didn't feel very well after going back. She even had a low fever at night. Qin Amlin was busy all night, and she finally settled down. Chapter 1565. There was a fine sweat on her body, and he gently wiped it off for her. Finally, he put her in his arms. "Liangqiu, I will find a way to get your mother out." Yi Liangqiu was stunned. He rubbed her hair. How could he not know what she was thinking? She always looked cold, but her heart was warm. Mrs. Su did not treat her well, but she could not be heartless. Yi Liangqiu looked at him, and her long hair stuck to her face. After a while, she said softly, "I dreamed of her." Qin Amlin reached out and gently held her in his arms. He stroked her long hair. "I will bring her out for her." She leaned on his shoulder, and her fingers quietly wrapped around his waist. She bit his shoulder. "Amlin, I feel like a dream." From a Yi family to the Su family, it was so heartbreaking. Qin Amlin understood her vulnerability. He reached out and stroked her little face. His voice was quiet. "Liangqiu, you have me in the future. They don't want me, and no one cares about me. Amlin, I'm unnecessary. She still cried. She used to yearn for family. She yearned for Wang Kaiyun to love her. She yearned for her biological mother, Mrs. Su. She even yearned for Su Shirqing's appreciation. But the fantasy was so easily shattered. For them, she was either a burden and dispensable, or she was a pawn. She admitted that she was a bit unreasonable, but she still could not help but feel sad. Qin Amlin held her face and kissed away the tears in the corner of her eyes. His action was very gentle, with infinite pity. Lianqiu, it's not like that. He coaxed her, because they don't know how to cherish it. They have too many selfish desires. They don't know how to love. Just like him, he also understood how good she was after so many twists and turns. Only then did he know that he could never leave her. She cried like a child in his arms. He coaxed her for a long time. Lianqiu, I have already kissed you. Don't cry. For the first time, she was so relieved to give herself to someone else. She was so relieved to give all her vulnerability to him. Thanks to Qin Amlin's efforts, Mrs. Su was finally taken back to the Su family. She finally had a good home. This was also because Su Shirqing was under pressure from the public, and he had his own plans. And Mrs. Su was not his target. Moreover, using Mrs. Su to threaten Lianqiu was useless. When the Su family picked up Mrs. Su, especially Mrs. Su's mother, she slapped Su Shirqing and forced him to write a divorce agreement. Lianqiu knew that if the Su family came forward, it was probably Qin Amlin's negotiation. He must have given something in exchange. That day, she was sitting in the car with Qin Amlin beside her. She watched as Mrs. Su walked out of the Su mansion. Mrs. Su's figure was thin, and she looked absent-minded. When the driver opened the door for Mrs. Su, she suddenly looked in Lianqiu's direction. Lianqiu sat in the car. Her body was a little stiff, and she did not move an inch. Qin Amlin sighed softly. He put his hand on the back of her hand and said in a low voice, Lianqiu, you can see her whenever you want to. There may not be such a chance in the future. Lianqiu looked at him. Her eyes were a little hot. Amlin, she called him and suddenly said, I feel that you are very forgiving now. He smiled. You know that too. With that said, he got out of the car and opened the door for her to get out. Chapter 1566. Lianqiu didn't move until Mrs. Su came over. Mrs. Su's surname was Chun. Old Madam Chun also came over. Although she was in her 80s, her eyes were still bright. She looked Lianqiu up and down before asking, Are you that child? Old Madam Chun was in politics. Her voice was naturally dignified. No one in the Chun family was not afraid of her. This time, they were able to successfully take Mrs. Su away because of Old Madam Chun. Old Madam Chun had a lot of dissatisfaction with this daughter. She had originally given up on her, but Qin Amlin came to the Chun family. Lianqiu was being looked at. She retracted her gaze and looked at the old woman in front of her. She smiled faintly and said, Yes. Old Madam Chin's expression was still old-fashioned and strict. In terms of seniority, you should call me grandmother. Lianqiu smiled faintly again. In terms of seniority, I should still call you Mayor Chun. But no one had ever dared to disobey the old woman like this. She was furious and glared at Lianqiu. You are so rebellious. No wonder your mother doesn't like you. Instead, she likes that weird Su Cheng. As she said that, her pair of shrewd eyes kept looking at Lianqiu, as if trying to see through her inner thoughts. Lianqiu remained unmoved. Kinship is nothing to begin with. Just like Mayor Chun, we're clearly related by blood, but what's the difference between that and not? Old Madam Chun was furious. You don't know what's good for you. She turned back to look in the direction of the Su family and sneered. Do you think he will let you go? You are the only heir of the Su family. That madman Su Shirqing will not give up so easily. You know he is a madman. Why did you agree to their marriage? Lianqiu looked at the ash-covered Old Madam Chun. Old Madam Chin's expression dimmed. Is there any use in stopping him? She looked at Mrs. Su. Mrs. Su was still in a daze. She held on to Lianqiu's hand and cautiously called out, Chung Chung. Qin Amlin held Lianqiu's hand to give her some warmth. He knew that she would be sad. However, she wasn't angry. Instead, she thought of Su Cheng. Yi Liangqiu was not a pretentious person. She could be unhappy, and she could get Anlin's comfort, but Su Cheng didn't give her anything. What she gave her was only the four corners of the sky. At this moment, she understood Mrs. Su's love for Su Cheng a little more. Su Cheng was a little crazy, but it could not be denied that she was also cute. He pursed his lips and allowed himself to be hugged by Mrs. Su without resisting. Her voice was a little low. "Mom," even if it was right before and now it was wrong. When she buried her head in Mrs. Su's shoulder, she really felt the warmth of an hour. Mom called her Su, called her little darling. It was a warmth that she hadn't felt for a long time. However, the price was too high. She closed her eyes. Her eyes felt a little hot, so hot that tears almost fell. Mrs. Su coaxed her and called her Chung Chung. She told her not to be afraid and that her mom was here. Yi Liangqiu closed her eyes. There was an indescribable feeling in her heart. She called out to her mom in a soft voice. Perhaps this was the last time. This was his only chance. Anlin is very good. Chung Chung, listen to him in the future, Mrs. Su said incoherently. Old Madam Chen's voice was dignified. All right, let's go. Chapter 1567. Mom has to go. Chung Chung, you can visit Mom later. Mrs. Su's tears flowed down. She still looked confused and couldn't tell who the person in front of her was. Yi Liangqiu watched her being taken away. From the beginning to the end, Mrs. Chen's face was stiff. She didn't give her daughter any warmth. Anlin, she's the same as me. She doesn't feel warmth. That's why she loves Su Shicheng so passionately, right? She put her head on his shoulder and asked softly. Qin Anlin watched the black limousine slowly drive away with her. Then he said, the Chun family has been in politics for generations. They are indifferent to human relationships. There are a lot of things that they can't control. He looked down at her. And your mother, she is a different kind of person in the Chun family. When she fell in love with Su Shicheng and insisted on marrying him, she was not optimistic about her. What he didn't say was that the Chun family was not optimistic about Mrs. Su. Consequently, they were not optimistic about Yi Liangqiu. Mrs. Su might not be able to get what she wanted when she went back, but at least her life would be safe. Maybe in the future, when Liangqiu gave birth to a child, he could pick Mrs. Su up and let her live in a place not far from them. If Liangqiu wanted to see her, she could see her. Su Shicheng didn't have many years to live. What Qin Anlin wanted to do now was to wait for him to die. From an emotional point of view, he didn't want to hurt Liangqiu. He always wanted to give the best to her. Anlin, thank you. She pursed her lips and looked up at him. Qin Anlin smiled and held her hand. Liangqiu, let's go home. She nodded and was helped into the car by him. On the second floor of the Su family's house, Su Shicheng stood there, watching Qin Anlin's car slowly drive away. The man standing behind him whispered, Why didn't you do something in the car? Su Shicheng slowly turned his head and glanced at him. Do you think I will let my own daughter die with me? That person didn't say anything because in his heart, there was nothing that Mr. Su couldn't give up. Su Shicheng looked into the distance again and said with melancholy, If I am gone in the future, who will witness the glory of ATV? He was running out of time. Originally, he had frozen his sperm, but he didn't have many years left. Even if he found a woman to give birth to a child, if he couldn't control it for himself, what was the point? The person behind him said in a deep voice, Mr. Su, I was wrong. Su Shicheng looked into the distance quietly. After a long time, he said, Is everything ready? The man nodded. I'm ready. Su Shicheng chuckled, then sent out tomorrow. As he spoke, he coughed a few more times. The man exclaimed, Let's call a doctor. No need. Su Shicheng's voice was very calm. Monin, there's no cure for my illness. He was only taking medicine to maintain his life. His illness came so fiercely. What could he do even if he was unwilling? Monin was a confidant cultivated by him. Hearing Su Shicheng say this, he didn't say anything. The next day, when Yi Liangqiu was alone at home in the afternoon, the maid at home delivered a package. Young madam, this is your package. It was sent by express. She took it and was a little surprised, but she still opened it. Inside was a CD. Yulianxio was a little curious, so she opened it. 10 seconds later, her face was completely pale. At the same time, her cell phone rang. The sound was like a ghost, touching her heart, as if it was pinched by something and she couldn't breathe. Chapter 1568. Liangxiu, did you see that? If you want to save them, don't hang up. Otherwise, I'll destroy her immediately. The voice on the other end was like a ghost. You can't bear to do that, can you? Think about Qin Anlin. He loves you so much. Yi Liangxiu looked at the computer. After a long time, she gently removed the disk from the computer and folded it in half. Then, holding the phone, she hesitated for a few seconds before going out. She was more than 4 months pregnant, but she still drove by herself. When the servant asked, she just said that she was going to Qin Anlin's company to deliver some documents. Sitting in the car, she turned on the phone and saw a scene that broke her heart. She had no choice but to drive to the place that Su Shicheng had specified. When she arrived at an abandoned factory, her car door was opened and 2 men in black came in. They quickly blindfolded her. Then, she got into another car. The car drove and stopped. After making countless turns, it stopped about an hour later. The cloth under Yi Liangxiu's face was removed. When she opened her eyes, she was surrounded by dark and rusty buildings. She held the phone and looked around. There was a big pool in the middle of the warehouse. Dirty water floated in it, and there were white things floating in it, which made people want to do evil things. Just then, a voice rang out. Liangxiu, you've come after all. Yi Liangxiu looked up and saw Su Shicheng. He was sick to begin with, and appearing in such a place made his body even more fragile. Are you crazy? Yi Liangxiu's body was trembling, and her voice was a little shrill. Where is she? Where is she? Ignoring herself, she walked up the iron-stained staircase and quickly went up. Su Shicheng was wearing a white shirt. 2 buttons were loose at the collar, and there was a scratch on his neck. It was a woman's fingernails. Yi Liangxiu's eyes were hot. Where is she? Tell me. Su Shicheng looked at her hysterical look and smiled faintly. You care about her a lot? As he got closer, she could smell the faint scent of a man and a woman who had done it. It was faint, but she could smell it. Yi Liangxiu's body swayed slightly. She almost couldn't accept such a blow. Are you crazy? Her face was covered in tears. How could you do something like that? That's Anlin's mother. Su Shicheng sneered. She volunteered. I didn't force her. He gently raised his hand, and a strange sound suddenly came from the pool below. A wooden prison slowly rose from the inside. The water curtain fell, revealing the people inside. It was a man without legs. His original appearance had long been unrecognizable. His hair was so long that it draped over his shoulders, and it was tangled. Su Shicheng held the railing with both hands and smiled faintly. Do you know who he is? Yi Liangxiu's face was stiff, and so was her body. She kept looking at the person in the wooden cell. A premonition rose in her heart. You've guessed it. Su Shicheng's fingers gently touched his lips. He's Qin Pei, Qin Anlin's father, a man who abandoned his wife and child. His expression suddenly became a little absent-minded, but Honko was still willing to give herself to me for his life. He turned his head and looked at Yi Liangxiu. Do you know that she has never had another man for so many years? Chapter 1569. The man in the wooden cell heard the noise and slowly raised his eyes to look at Su Shicheng and Yi Liangxiu. There was a trace of sadness in his eyes. Just an hour ago, he had personally witnessed his wife being pressed under Su Shicheng's body and doing that as if she had gone crazy. He and Hong had been married for so many years, but he did not love her that much. Otherwise, he would not have left so easily. However, after not seeing each other for so many years, she had aged. On the day they reunited, she cried her heart out. She did not scold him for being unfaithful, but her heart ached for what he had gone through. Honka was pulled away. Su Shicheng, that bastard, actually let her choose. If she did not want him to die, she would do that with Su Shicheng. Honka was over 50 years old. She had lived her whole life high and virtuous. She was such a proud woman. When he left, she did not cry or ask him to stay. But now, she already had silver hair, but she had given herself to Su searching for him. When her silver hair fell, he seemed to see their wedding day. At that time, she was so beautiful. On their wedding night, she had also let her hair down and lay in his arms. The overlapping memories turned out to be the most tragic pain in the world. This kind of pain exceeded all the pain he had suffered all these years. He called her name again and again. Hong Ko, why did you do this? Why did you care about me? Why did you care about my life and death? A person like me does not deserve to die. She was not a little girl after all. She was in pain. She was in pain. She let out painful sounds. Every sound was a death to him. At that moment, he wished he could die. He hit his head with all his might, desperately trying to kill himself. In the abandoned warehouse, his mournful cries could be heard. Hong Ko lay on the ground, and a tear fell from the corner of her eye. However, he did not know that she had liked him since she was young. She had liked him for a very long time. She had done so much for him. But he did not know and left just like that. She wanted to hate him, and she had hated him for so many years. But in the end, her heart still ached for him. She had said that she was older than him by 3 years. No matter what mistake he had made, she would forgive him once. Qin, you're back. You become like this. Her heart ached. That teardrop almost corroded Qin-Pei's heart. After so many years, he felt guilty towards her, but he didn't really regret it. It was because he felt that he didn't love her, and it would be better if he left. But now, he wanted to love her. He wanted to start over. He remembered that morning when he woke up, she wanted him to hold her and tell him that she was pregnant. How nice it would be if he didn't leave. They would have a daughter, and they would be happy. He was the one who destroyed everything. Qin-Pei's eyes were fixed on Su Shicheng, while Yi Liangqiu's face was pale. Suddenly, Qin-Pei let out a strange sound, calling Hong Ko's name. Yi Liangqiu froze for a moment and ran in the opposite direction. She ran as fast as she could, not caring that she was pregnant. She was afraid that if she was any slower, she would be too slow. But when she ran into a small abandoned house, she was still too slow. Lady Qin leaned against the wall, only covered with a coat. Her hair was loose, and a few strands of silver could be vaguely seen. Her face seemed to have aged a lot in an instant, but it also seemed like she was a little girl. She held a metal rod in her hand tightly, and a stream of blood slowly flowed down from her forehead. Chapter 1570. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she tried to lift Mrs. Qin up, but she couldn't. Mom! She patted Lady Qin's face and said anxiously, Mom, don't fall asleep. Don't fall asleep. Lady Qin lay in her arms. She opened her eyes slightly and closed them weakly. After such a long time, Lady Qin said with difficulty, Liangqiu, let's go, let's go, let's go. The blood on her forehead flowed down her cheeks, and the dark red stained Yi Liangqiu's sight. Lady Qin's face twitched slightly, and a tear fell from the corner of her eye. I can't let him go. I know. Her eyes fell on Yi Liangqiu's face, and there was a touch of sadness in her eyes. She knew that she and Amlin would be implicated, but she still had a glimmer of hope that Su Shicheng would let Qin-Pei go. But when she heard that Liangqiu was coming, she knew that she should die. She didn't want to keep the last trace of life. She was the shame of Amlin. She couldn't live anymore. Her fingers suddenly grasped Yi Liangqiu's hand, and she used the last of her strength. Liangqiu, don't tell Amlin. She raised him, so how could she not know his character? Even if he killed Su Shicheng, even if he chopped Su Shicheng into meat paste, Amlin would suffer for the rest of his life, and he would feel guilty. But it wasn't Amlin's fault. It was her. She couldn't let go of that person. Su Shicheng stood at the door and looked at the wound on Lady Qin's forehead in shock. Yi Liangqiu hated him, but she didn't want Lady Qin to die. She couldn't die. If she died, what would happen to Amlin? Send her to the hospital. She looked at Su Shicheng, and her voice was sad. Su Shicheng quickly walked over and half knelt beside Lady Qin. His fingers trembled as he stroked her wound. His voice trembled even more. Honka, why did you do this? Do you really hate me that much? He really couldn't accept it. How was he inferior to Qin-Pei? When Qin Pei left, if not for Hong Ku, how would King Entertainment be where it is today? His fingers sank deep in her flesh, his heart aching. Lady Qin opened her eyes slightly and looked at Su Shirqing. This man loved her. He had loved her his entire life. She knew it, but she couldn't fit anyone else in her heart. Let him go. Lady Qin clasped Su Shirqing's arm with her fingers and said in a hurry, let him go. She had already lived for so many years, while Qin Pei had lived a life worse than death for so many years. She wanted him to go back and take a look. The house in which they had lived was just as he had left it, the same silver candlestick that had been lit on the night of their wedding on her dressing table. She had waited for so long and hoped for so long. She had lit it every day to take a look before going to bed, hoping that he would come back. Now, she knew that he was still alive, but his life made her heart ache. Hopefully, there would be a next life as husband and wife. Qin Pei, are you willing to make up for my lifetime of waiting? However, she couldn't ask him anymore. Her old eyes were dyed red, and that trace of red climbed up the last trace of her face. Qin Pei, I'm a little tired from waiting. I want to rest. I'll go back to our home and wait for you. She let out her last breath and said, let him go. However, she couldn't say the last word. Mom, Mom, Mom. Yi Lianxiu knelt and looked at Lady Qin. Chapter 1571. Her fingers trembled as she caressed Qin Fu's face. She called her name again and again. However, the eccentric lady who first met her would never wake up again. She seemed to have lived a wealthy life, but she was actually lonelier than anyone else. She dedicated her life to the Qin family. She gave her last breath to Qin Pei. Yi Lianxiu hugged Lady Qin. Her tears fell like rain. She let out a sorrowful cry, Mom. She pressed her face against Lady Qin and didn't let go. Warm tears brushed past Lady Qin's face, but they could no longer warm her. Mom, are you still in pain? She murmured. It must be very painful to bear the humiliation that she didn't want to bear. Mom, it won't hurt very soon. I'll send you off on your last journey on behalf of Anlin, okay? I can't let others check your body and let your last words be trampled on. Mom, don't worry. I'll let him live. I'll protect Anlin. I will. I'll avenge you. Mom, it will hurt later. Anlin won't be able to see you for the last time. He will hate me. If he hates me, then so be it. Yi Lianxiu smiled gently. Mom, we are actually the same kind of people. Once we love someone, we won't give them up. We'll love them to the end, even if we have to risk our lives. We'll use our last breath. If only one person can be happy, Mom, I hope that person is Anlin. Yes, it's Anlin. Yi Lianxiu stood up slowly. Her expression was a little dazed, and her eyes were a little dazed. Su Shirqing was the same. He was still immersed in his own grief. Honka, how could you be so stupid? It's not worth it for that man. However, no matter how much it's not worth it, it can't be exchanged for her life. At this moment, Su Shirqing couldn't say that he didn't regret it. Do you have gasoline? Yi Lianxiu turned to look at Su Shirqing. Her voice was very soft. Su Shirqing's old eyes looked a little listless. After hearing her words, he turned to look at his daughter in shock. Obviously, she was calmer than him. Do you want Qin Anlin to know what you did to his mother? Yi Lianxiu's voice was cold, as if it was frozen. Su Shirqing's heart twitched. After all, he was smarter than most people. He immediately understood what she meant. His daughter was making a deal with him. Qin Pei was in his hands. It was obvious that Lianxiu didn't want Anlin to know about his relationship with Qin Anlin's mother. In that case, someone had to take the blame for Hong Ku's death. His heart was filled with sorrow for Hong Ku's death, but at the same time, there was a wisp of excitement in his blood. Lianxiu was finally coming back. I think we all know what kind of person you are. Yi Lianxiu looked at him. My condition is to let Qin Pei go. This was the last wish of Anlin's mother. She wanted to fulfill her wish. However, Su Shirqing smiled coldly. If I let him go, you'll probably immediately turn around and deal with me. His sadness only lasted for a moment. Yi Lianxiu had already seen through him. How could she not understand? She had lost this round of chess long ago. It wasn't just Anlin's mother and Qin Pei, but also the child in her stomach I will stay in the Su family as you wish. She compromised, but you have to leave Qin Pei alive. One day, she would make Su Shurqing pay the price for everything he had done to her. Her mother, Amlin's mother, Su Chung, everyone. Chapter 1572. She would stay in the Su family and watch him die of old age. She wanted to end him with her own hands. Even if she lost everything, including Amlin. Even if she was rebellious, she still had to do it. She knelt down and used her sleeves to wipe away the blood on Lady Qin's face. Then, she combed her hair neatly. She had always been a decent person. She had to leave with dignity. Mom, I'm sorry. She had no other choice. When the fire rose to the sky, her fingers tightly clutched her stomach, where the child kept moving uneasily. Baby, this is Grandma. When you're born, you won't be able to see her. But Mom will always remember. Yi Liangxiu stood woodenly with her hands hanging by her sides. She was powerless. She couldn't save Lady Qin. She could only choose to let her leave with dignity. The sound of burning was like the sound of flowers quietly blooming in the dark night. Burning, blooming. It was Hong Ku, the last fireworks of her life. In that fire, outside in the wooden prison, Qin Pei's hand gripped the wooden bars tightly. His long nails dug into his flesh. Dark red blood flowed down his rough black skin. It was a shocking sight. His coarse and messy hair covered his face. His expression couldn't be seen. Only a pair of lifeless eyes could be seen looking upstairs. Hong Ku. Qin Pei murmured his wife's name. Only then did he vaguely remember that they were still husband and wife. Back then, they didn't divorce. He took his first love and ran away. Why were you so stupid? It's not worth it. I'm not worth it. There were 2 clear lines of tears on his face. However, these tears came too late. Was that fire Hong Ku? Hong Ku. He let out a mournful cry, but his body began to sink. He returned to that dark place. And after that, he returned to the world, but he could never see that face again. His last memory of her was those 2 lines of tears. She only cried for one person in her life. She shed all her tears for him, but in the end, she only received his repentance. Yi Liangxiu took Lady Qin's ashes and drove back to the place where Lady Qin lived. As soon as she returned, the thing she was holding in her hands gave Crispy sleeve of fright. Liangxiu, you're pregnant. How can you hold such an inauspicious thing? It'll be terrible if old Madam sees it. Yi Liangxiu's eyes were a little dull. Aunt Sue, Mom is here. Milky Sleeve looked left and right and patted Xiong's chest. This child is possessed. I don't know how Amlin took care of him. How could he touch such a thing? She reached out to take it away and throw it away, but her hand was scalded the moment she touched it. Why is it so hot? Yi Liangxiu hugged him tightly, her eyes staring straight at Qinxiu. Mom is inside. Crisp Sleeve was stunned. Then her facial muscles started to tremble, and she started to panic. Old Madam, where's Old Madam? Old Madam said she was taking a nap. Why wasn't she here for a few hours? She stared at the thing in Yi Liangxiu's hand. Then, she turned around and walked upstairs. She didn't believe it. She had to see Old Madam. Old Madam must be sleeping soundly in the room. Liangxiu must have been possessed. It must be. The door opened suddenly, but Lady Qin wasn't in the bedroom. Chapter 1573. She stared blankly for a long time. Then, she heard a scream from the maid downstairs. She ran down and saw that Yi Liangxiu was slowly collapsing, but she was still hugging the box in her hands. She reached out to pull it open. Her hand had been scalded with 7 or 8 huge blisters. She was stunned and held the box for a long time. Old lady, is this you? Her hands were burning and her heart was trembling. After a long time, Su Xiu let out a sorrowful cry and then fainted. But the box was still in her hands. Similarly, Su Xiu's hands were scalded. The wound on their hands would never fade. When Yi Liangxiu woke up, she was on the bed in the bedroom upstairs. As soon as she woke up, she felt a burning pain in her hands. She raised her hands and glanced at them. Her hands were wrapped in strips of white cloth. They had already been bandaged. You're awake? She heard a familiar, gentle voice. Yuliancio sat up. To her surprise, it was Dr. May. Dr. May sat by the bed. Her voice was still gentle, but her expression was indescribably solemn. Amlin is dealing with his mother's funeral, so he asked me to take care of you. Yuliancio heard the sound of chanting the Diamond Sutra coming from downstairs. One sound after another, it was like the door to that world. Liangxiu, Amlin is very sad. You have to understand. Dr. May was familiar with her and loved her as a junior. She knew Lady Qin even better. Although it was sudden, she felt that Liangxiu must have suffered a huge blow. This accident must have been a conspiracy. She hoped that she could convince Liangxiu to tell the truth so that the murderer could be caught and Hong Ku's soul in heaven could be comforted. Speaking of this, Dr. May's eyes turned red. She was a doctor and should have seen through life and death. But Hong Ku had turned into a jar of ashes for no reason. Even she couldn't accept it, let alone Amlin. Hong Ku had worked hard to bring Amlin up. She had even handed over King Entertainment to Amlin. How could she accept this ending? Yuliancio hugged her knees and buried her face. Her body trembled at the thought of Lady Qin leaving. She couldn't say it. She couldn't tell Amlin the truth. He wouldn't be able to take it. He would have to live in the shadow for the rest of his life. She did not speak. Dr. May sighed softly. It was not her place to meddle in this matter. As they were talking, the door opened, and a slender figure stood at the door. Dr. May looked at it for a while and patted Yuliancio's shoulder. You guys talk. I'll go down and light some incense. She walked out. At the door, she said in a low voice, I remember she's pregnant. There was no expression on Qin Amlin's face. His usually handsome face was full of coldness. He clenched his fists and pursed his lips into a straight line. Auntie May, you can go down first. Dr. May sighed softly and went down first. But when she reached the middle of the stairs, the door upstairs was slammed shut. Her heart trembled. She wanted to go up, but felt that it was inappropriate. In the end, she sighed again and went down. Downstairs, Soft Sleeve knelt in the morning hall. She was dressed in white and looked at Lady Qin's photo in a daze. What a pitiful person. Dr. May sighed softly. Soft Sleeve had grown up with Lady Qin and followed her to the Qin family. After Qin Pei left, it was Soft Sleeve who accompanied Hong Ku for the rest of her life. Chapter 1574. Dr. May slowly walked over and took the paper money from Su Xiao. As she burned it, she said in a low voice, when she was here, you treated her as your master and followed her for the rest of your life. Now that she's gone, you should take good care of yourself. Su Xiao, Hong Ku never treated you as a servant. She wanted the best for you. Su Xiao was still staring at the old lady's photo in a daze. Her tears never stopped. After a long time, she said softly, if she had passed away because of old age, I would have found a quiet place, bought a piece of land, and enjoyed a few years of happiness. But she passed away for no reason. It feels like a piece of my heart has been dug out. She turned her head and looked at Dr. May. There's hatred in my heart. I know it was done by that bastard, but I don't know why young madam didn't say anything. Only Yuliancio knew the truth. But now that the old lady's body was gone, none of them knew what had happened, and no matter how much hatred Amlin had, he wouldn't be completely heartless to young madam. Dr. May lit a stick of incense and slowly bent down. After a while, she looked at the portrait of Lady Qin and said calmly but firmly, Su Xiao, do you believe that time will tell the truth? And she believed that Hong Ku wouldn't have doted on Liangxiu for nothing. That child had a forbearing attitude. She wasn't that kind of heartless person. Upstairs, Qin Amlin slammed the door. His face was gloomy, and a storm was brewing. He was an idiot. She brought his mother back without saying a word. She was trying her best to cover up the truth, and it had something to do with Su Shurchen. Can you explain? He looked at her and slowly walked over. But he walked past her, walked to the window, and looked out. His entire back was straight. He was enduring. He was afraid that he would lose control and hit her. She didn't speak. He took out a wrinkled pack of cigarettes from his pocket. There was only one cigarette in it. He took it out and put on his lips, lighting it up and taking a long drag. He didn't turn around and waited for her to speak. After smoking half a cigarette, he finally turned around slowly, and his eyes fell on her face. Yi Liangqiu, is this your choice? She chose to tolerate such a despicable man and gloss over his mother's death? I didn't. She looked up at his face. In just a few hours, she had experienced life and death, while he had experienced death and betrayal. No? Then tell me, how did my mother die, and how did she turn into ashes? He closed his eyes and asked in a hoarse voice. Yi Liangqiu replied blankly. I was in a warehouse. I saw my mom being killed, and then she couldn't continue. She knew that lies were the easiest to be exposed. The more she said, the more flaws there would be. Qin Anlin turned around and walked towards her slowly. He held a cigarette in one hand and pinched her delicate chin with the other. He looked at her coldly. Then what? He's been burnt to ashes, isn't he? Her eyelashes fluttered as she looked at him, and so did her lips. After a long time, she finally said, yes. He tightened his grip. Yi Liangqiu, do you think I'm a fool? His handsome face approached her. His eyes were filled with a storm. What are you trying to hide for? Huh? No matter what, he could indulge her. No matter what, she could have it. Even if she wanted King Entertainment, he wouldn't blame her if she took it away. Chapter 1575. Their faces were very close to each other, and their eyes were so close that they could almost see themselves in each other's eyes. No! She closed her eyes. When I got there, it was already like this. I saw Mom for the last time. Her body stiffened when she said that. Her jaw was almost crushed. Do you think I'll believe you? He looked at her in disappointment, and his voice became colder. I'll ask you one last time. Yi Liangqiu, have you made your choice? She covered her face with her fingers. Anlin, I can't choose. Never. She looked up at him, tears trickling down from the corners of her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. She smiled lightly. Will you hand me over to the police? Yes. He didn't hesitate. That one word also represented a break, represented his choice. Yi Liangqiu looked up. Then let me go. But before I go, let me burn some incense for Mom, she said in a low voice. After she said that, she received a hard slap on her face. Her face was tilted to one side. There was a handprint on her fair face, and it was even swollen. She couldn't turn her face around for a long time. She touched her face with her bandaged hand and asked softly, You won't even give me this chance, right? You're not worthy. Qin Anlin spat out these words coldly. She was in pain, but he was in more pain than her. Within a day, he had lost two of the women he loved the most. Qin Anlin called the police, and Yi Liangqiu was taken away and detained. She didn't defend herself and only said a few words at the police station. For those few days, the atmosphere in City B was heavy. On the day of Lady Qin's funeral, it was drizzling. Qin Anlin stood in front of her grave for the whole day. He was drenched by the rain, and his face was wet. They had found Yi Liangqiu's phone records. Before the incident, it was Su Shicheng who called her. However, in the detention center, she didn't say a word. She didn't reveal a single word. Qin Anlin didn't look at her. He knew he was cruel, but he could only be cruel to her. He did not want to divorce her. There was no need. He was unwilling to let her go, and he was even more unwilling to let himself go. He wanted her to bear the name of Qin Anlin's wife for the rest of her life. The tombstone was soaked by the rain. He slowly squatted down. His tall body was dressed in black, which made him look even more solemn. She reached out and stroked Lady Qin's tombstone. Her voice was very low. Mom, I still can't stop loving her. I still can't be cruel to her. His head rested on the tombstone. Hong Ke's youthful appearance was smiling, but it was soaked in water, as if she was weeping. The color of the sky gradually darkened. However, that smear of darkness did not leave for a long time. The sky was shrouded by dark clouds. The sky above B City was so dark that it was suffocating. The next day, Qin Anlin went to the detention center to see Yi Liangqiu. When she came out, she had lost a lot of weight. When she sat down, she looked up at him. He had lost weight, but his facial features and gaze looked sharper and colder. She had never seen Qin Anlin like this. She couldn't imagine what Anlin would do if he knew the truth and Qin Pei was killed. She couldn't imagine it. She would rather be the one who was hurt. Have you thought it through? His voice was hoarse and emotionless. Chapter 1576. Perhaps this was the last time she would care about him openly. The next time they met, she would be his enemy. She was the person he hated the most. Sheen Amlin's body leaned against the backrest. He was wearing a black shirt with 2 buttons undone and a trench coat of the same color. He reminded her of the old Sheen Amlin. She didn't know when, but he had toned down his aura. Now it was all gone. She felt a little sad in her heart, but this kind of sadness was her own choice. He had indeed lost a lot of weight, but she had lost even more weight. Other than this, don't you have anything else to say to me? He took out a cigarette and put it on his lips. He didn't light it up and just stared at her. Yi Liangxiu pursed her lips, lowered her eyes, and looked at him with a pleading gaze. Is Muyin okay? He took the cigarette down and stared at her for a long time before asking sternly, Yi Liangxiu, do you remember that you are Muyun's mother? Do you remember that you are carrying my child? If you remember, you won't treat yourself so cruelly and force me. Sheen Amlin's handsome face looked at her, and as Adam's apple couldn't help moving, she was still looking at him with a pleading gaze. Sheen Amlin pursed his thin lips and smiled coldly. When you think it through, you can ask Muyin, okay? She knew what he meant. If she didn't tell the truth, he would be cruel to her, and she might never see Muyin in this lifetime. At that moment, she hesitated, but in the end, she still gave up. Once you decided, Yi Liangxiu, you have to do it. You can't give up because of a moment of soft-heartedness and become weak. I've said everything I should say. She opened her mouth bitterly, her thin white fingers intertwining gently, pretending that one hand was his. She looked up at him with a passionate gaze. In the future, could they still be together? After she had turned her back on him, after he had hated her so much. Yi Liangxiu did not know. She only knew that she could no longer turn back. If he gave up now, Qin Pei would lose his life, Amlin's mother would not be able to rest in peace, and Amlin would suffer for the rest of his life. Between them was the crime that Su Shicheng had done to his mother. Would they be happy? No, even if she said it out, they would not be happy. Amlin couldn't go, because that was his mother. Qin Amlin looked at her and said slowly, I'll give you 3 more days. He got up and walked towards the door. Yi Liangxiu looked at his back and felt a sense of melancholy. Amlin. She softly called his name, a bit hurried. He looked back at her with a cold expression and said word by word, Miss Yi, worry about yourself because you might be charged with murder. She pursed her lips and her face was a little pale. Then she chuckled. Thank you for your reminder. You don't need to thank me. This is a warning. He looked at her deeply. He looked at her, sitting there in a blue dress, looking haggard. This was his newlywed wife, but at this moment, she was like a passerby. He felt a little sad and immediately turned around to walk outside. When he was outside, his eyes felt a little hot, and he blinked a few times before closing them. Chapter 1577. Qin Amlin slowly opened his eyes, turned around, and looked at the house behind him. After looking at it for a long time, he got into the car. Khan followed him. His heart was also heavy, because not long ago, Su Cheng had also gone in once. Khan tilted his head and looked at Qin Amlin's cold face. He said softly, Since you care, why don't you take it slow? I believe that Miss Yi wouldn't do such a thing. Qin Amlin was silent for a long time before he said, I can give in to anything, but not this. His mother had turned into ashes in an instant. She had hidden it for Su Shicheng, so he couldn't live with her anymore. He couldn't face her face, and he couldn't face his mother in the underworld. However, he still couldn't be cruel to her. He even cared if she ate well in there and whether she could sleep or not. He hated himself for being like this. He lied to himself and told himself that it was all because of the child in her stomach. But in the dead of night, he still missed her. He hated himself. Kime sighed and didn't dare to say anything else, saying too much wouldn't change anything. The car slowly drove to the apartment, and Qin Amlin sat in the car for a long time. Kime's voice was very soft. President Qin, go back to the company first. Call me if you need anything. Qin Amlin said as he opened the car door and got out. He took the elevator to the top floor. Mu Yun was at home, and Qingxiu was taking care of the child. After the old lady passed away, Qingxiu didn't eat or drink all day, and she kept talking about the old lady. It couldn't go on like this, so Qin Amlin still brought Qingxiu and Mu Yun here. He said that he wanted her to take care of Mu Yun, but in fact, it was just to give her spiritual sustenance. Qin Amlin didn't go in immediately. Instead, he smoked outside before walking in. As soon as he opened the door, he saw an unexpected guest sitting on the sofa. Xia Mian. Qin Amlin held the door with his hand and didn't close it. He quietly looked at the girl sitting there. For a moment, he thought it was Liangxiu. Liangxiu, who was a few years younger, came back, but when they saw her clearly, it was Xia Mian. Xia Mian was sitting on the sofa in a white dress, playing aeroplane with Mu Yun. Her expression was especially pure, and the way she looked at Mu Yun was also very kind. Qin Amlin leaned against the door and said in a cold voice, "Miss Xia, no one invited you here." Xia Mian raised her eyes and looked at Qin Amlin. After a while, she said bitterly, "I just wanted to take a look." As she spoke, she twisted her slender fingers helplessly. Qin Amlin had seen many women, but he was still cold. "What are you looking at?" "I came to see if the house is short a mistress, isn't it?" "I didn't." Xia Mian's voice was urgent as she stood up. Her face was tense as she said firmly, "President Qin, I'm not the kind of person you think I am. I just came from my hometown. I heard that something happened to your family, so I came to show my concern. I have no ulterior motives." "Miss Xia, let me remind you again." Qin Amlin seemed to be unable to bear it. "We don't have any friendship. We just know each other. Do you understand? I don't want you to disturb my life anymore." Xia Mian's face became even paler. Her lips moved, but she couldn't say anything for a long time. After a long time, she lowered her head and said awkwardly, "I'll leave immediately." Chapter 1578. Xia Mian picked up a denim jacket from the sofa and said in a low voice, "Don't bother, Aunt Sue. I'll go back to the dorm to eat." Su Qiuxiu untied the apron, glanced at Qin Amlin, and said slowly, "I asked Miss Xia to stay for dinner. This child came to see us early in the morning, so it's not too much to ask for a meal." Qin Amlin had always respected Su Qiuxiu, especially when the old lady passed away. Su Qiuxiu's grief was no less than his. At this time, how could he not give her face? So he didn't say anything and went straight to the bedroom to change. He wore a pair of coffee-colored casual pants with a white sweater on top. It was very homey. Plus, he had lost weight recently, so he looked melancholy. Xia Mian's face was a little hot. She didn't dare to look at him and turned her little face away. Qin Amlin carried Mu Yun to the dining chair, and Su Qiuxiu said to Xia Mian, "Miss Xia, let's sit together." Xia Mian carefully sat in the last seat, and she looked a little uncomfortable. She didn't come from a good family, so she wasn't used to everything here. Although she had been in and out of some places, she still felt uncomfortable now. When she passed by the master bedroom, she secretly saw a huge photo of Liangxiu. There was also the super big bed. Her mind was filled with the scene of them doing that kind of thing on the bed. She couldn't get rid of it. Xia Mian looked at it for a long time, and her heart was filled with deep jealousy. She looked up and picked up a piece of braised pork for little Mu Yun. "Good boy, eat more. Eat more to gain weight." Mu Yun didn't eat, but looked at Xia Mian. "Public chopsticks." Xia Mian was stunned and couldn't help but say, "What? Don't you have saliva on your chopsticks?" Mu Yun's voice was just as impatient as Qin Amlin's. Only then did Xia Mian understand what he meant. Her face was a little red, and she quickly put the piece of meat back in her bowl and picked up a pair of public chopsticks. "Also, I don't like meat." Mu Yun's voice was a little cold. It didn't sound like a 7 or 8-year-old kid at all. To Xia Mian, it sounded a little difficult to deal with. Little Mu Yun was quite well-behaved and easy to get along with when she played with him previously. She was put on the spot, and her face was pale. She looked at Su Xiu for help. "Aunt Su, I originally thought that you were here to apply to be a nanny," Xiao Mu Yun said straightforwardly. She was not too polite. Qin Amlin didn't stop him. "Originally? Little Mu Yun's idea was also his. He was very dissatisfied with the sudden appearance of a woman, but he could not do anything about it. Therefore, he did not correct his son's impoliteness, but rejoiced instead. Crispy Sleeve gently stroked Mu Yun's hair. You can't be so rude. Sister Xiao Mian came to see us. Did she come to see Dad? Does she want to be my new mother? Yi Mu Yun's voice was merciless, and it wasn't as sharp as a child's. Tears were already welling up in Xiao Mian's eyes. After a long time, she said softly, President Qin, I'd better leave first. Su Xiao didn't quite agree. Qin Anlin just said faintly, I'll see Miss Xiao off. He thought that he still had something to say to her. He didn't want to face and deal with her, but in order to avoid trouble in the future, he wanted to make it clear to her. Xiao Mian was a little surprised, and her eyes lit up. However, when she looked into his eyes, the light quickly dimmed. Chapter 1579. Qin Anlin's eyes were a little gloomy. Miss Xia, I'd better walk you out. His tone was a little domineering. Then, he opened the door and walked out first. Xiao Mian had no choice, so she pursed her lips and followed him out. Outside the door, Qin Anlin was leaning against the elevator. His chin was a little blue, and he looked unprecedentedly dispirited and tired. Xiao Mian walked over slowly until she was about 2 steps away from him. President Qin, let's go. He didn't look at her and directly pressed the button for the elevator. Xiao Mian followed him into the elevator uneasily. The mirror in the elevator reflected their figures. Xiao Mian's eyes were a little misty as she looked at them. At this time, he was almost single. He had been abandoned by Yi Liangxiu, so why couldn't she take advantage of this opportunity? She told herself that if she lost this chance, she might never have another chance. Mr. Qin, she bit her lip and suddenly had the courage to say, I like you, as if she was afraid that he would overthink it. She added, just because you are Qin Anlin and nothing else. Qin Anlin looked in the direction of the elevator door. He heard her words, but didn't respond immediately. After about 5 seconds, the elevator reached the first floor. He walked over and pressed the elevator button, saying faintly, Miss Xia, don't come here anymore. He didn't even reply, treating her as if she were air dispensable. Xiao Mian was a bit shocked. In her opinion, he should be the one being comforted the most at this moment. But when he was facing her, facing a face that resembled Yi Liangxiu's, he was indifferent. His performance was impeccable. Xiao Mian was embarrassed again. Unwilling to give up, she quickly grabbed his arm and looked up at him. I want to be with you. Qin Anlin looked down at her hand that was touching him. After a moment, he reached out and took her hand away. His voice was still indifferent. I have a wife. Miss Xia, please behave yourself. But Xiao Mian didn't want to give up. She looked up and said emotionally, Why? How could she still be your wife? How could she do such a thing? Qin Anlin suddenly grabbed her hand, and with a loud bang, Xiao Mian's body was thrown against the wall of the elevator. His body pressed against hers tightly, almost squeezing all the air out of her lungs. He looked down at her coldly and pinched her chin with one hand. He lowers his head. Jun Yin is very close to her. The breath coming out of his thin lips is also cold. What qualifications do you have to say about her? Just because you've seen me a few times, just because you're young and good-looking? Xiao Mian breathed as hard as she could. Her chest heaved up and down violently. She looked at the man in front of her. No, at this moment, he was as cold as the Grim Reaper. But this kind of coldness was desperately attracting her. She couldn't resist. No. She shook her head and suddenly hugged his shoulders. I want to love you. I want to take care of you. Really, I don't want a title. I can even help you take care of Mu Yun. His eyes narrowed, and one hand moved downward. Xiao Mian gasped. She never thought that Qin Anlin would do something like this to her, let alone in the elevator. She trembled, but she didn't refuse. He stared into her eyes and said slowly, Xiao Mian, this is what you want, isn't it? She desperately shook her head and nodded, her eyes full of tears. Chapter 1580. However, in just 2 seconds, Cheen Amlin let go of her and stepped back completely. His eyes were filled with coldness, and the corner of his mouth was curled into a sneer. To me, a woman like this is just a prostitute. Xiaomian's body fell against the wall of the elevator, her fingers pressed against the cold wall behind her. She should have left. She had been deeply insulted by him. He had only touched her twice, but he had said that she was no different from that kind of woman. Xiaomian was arrogant, but this kind of arrogance was completely lost in front of Cheen Amlin. She lightly gasped, then gently stepped forward and reached out to stroke Cheen Amlin's forehead comfortingly. "I don't care. I just want you to be happy." Her hand was pushed away, and her body hit the wall again. This time, he just looked at her coldly. "Do I need it just because you gave it to me?" His thin lips were tightly pursed, and his voice was stern. "Miss Xia, go back to your own world. Don't provoke me, or I will make it impossible for you to survive and be city." Xiaomian blinked and finally blinked back her tears. She also finally understood that the man in front of her didn't need her. He wasn't being unreasonable, he wasn't playing hard to get, and he wasn't playing tricks. He really didn't like her. She didn't understand why he didn't like her. She clearly looked like that person. But in the end, he still left without any reluctance. He only treated her as air, or even as trash. Cheen Amlin smoked a few cigarettes outside before going back. When he walked in, Crispy Sleeve was busy in the kitchen, and Yi Muyun was sitting on the sofa, looking a little lonely. Since the incident, the little guy hadn't asked anything. Just looking at him made Cheen Amlin think of Yi Liangxiu, and his heart ached a little. He slowly walked over, reached out to pick up his son, and pressed the little head into his arms. Little Mu Yun buried his head, and his little hands quietly hugged his waist. This small action let Cheen Amlin know that the little guy was actually feeling uneasy. He didn't say anything, but it didn't mean that Mu Yun didn't think about it. "Why did you play with her before?" he asked Xiaomian in a low voice. Judging from Yi Muyun's attitude towards Xiaomian, it was obvious that he didn't like her. However, little Muyun got along well with Xiaomian. The little girl in his arms said in a muffled voice, "I just want to see that face. Will Daddy like her because she looks like Mommy?" Cheen Amlin's heart was wet. He reached out to rub his son's hair and said in a hoarse voice, "No, Daddy won't like her." Little Muyun buried his head in his father's arms again. After a while, he asked softly, "Does Daddy still like Mommy?" This time, Cheen Amlin didn't answer him immediately. He sighed slightly and rubbed his son's hair without saying anything. Crispy Sleeve came out of the kitchen and was stunned when she saw the father and son. Then he asked slowly, "Has Miss Xia left?" Cheen Amlin patted his son in his arms and grunted. Then he said, "Don't let her in the future. She doesn't have many people to interact with." Crispy Sleeve was stunned, and then she said slowly, "At this time, it's good that Mu Yun can interact with some people. Besides, Amlin, you should also think about the future." How could Cheen Amlin not hear the strong hint in her words? Not only did he not think about it, but he also disagreed with it. He frowned and said, "Aunt Sue, don't say this in front of Mu Yun." Chapter 1581. But Qingxiu didn't think much of it. "We'll have to talk about it publicly in the future." In her heart, Yi Liangxiu was a good person, and Amlin loved her very much. But she had married into the Qin family, and now that old madam had met with such a huge incident, if her heart wasn't on Amlin's side, it would mean that she had made a choice. What was Amlin still hesitating about? If he cut ties with her now, it would be beneficial to him and King Entertainment. She also knew that Amlin still had hope in his heart and was still giving her a chance. But after so many days, as long as Yi Liangxiu had some guts, she would have stood up and said something. She felt pity that old madam had doted on the wrong person for nothing. Now that she was old, she didn't even get to see her son. Qingxiu didn't hate Yi Liangxiu that much, but she blamed her. At this moment, Amlin's heart was in pain. If Amlin and Miss Xia were together, it would be a temporary comfort. Cheen Amlin's voice was a little cold. "Auntie Sue, I've never said that before. About the divorce. Ching Xiu wanted to say something, but she didn't dare to continue when she saw his expression. Although he treated her like family, she was still a subordinate. Little Mu Yin looked at his father and pursed his lips. After a while, he asked softly, "Daddy, will you divorce Mommy?" Qin Anlin looked down at his son and smiled. No. Little Mu Yin didn't dare to ask for his mother. He knew that if he were to pester him, it would only make his father upset. Qing Xiu sighed and returned to her room. 3 days later, at the detention center, Qin Anlin walked slowly into the guest room. Liangqiu was already sitting there. It had been 3 days since they last met, and she hadn't changed much. She was still fine. Qin Anlin sat down and looked at her deeply. Have you thought it through? Liangqiu's gaze was even more fervent than his. There was a look of nostalgia on her face. She looked at him quietly for a long time before saying, I've already found a lawyer. That short sentence made him disappointed and even despair. He closed his eyes slightly, and his voice seemed to have aged 10 years. Liangqiu, have you thought it through? Anlin, I'm sorry. She looked at him, not willing to look away for even a second. Qin Anlin slowly opened his eyes, which seemed to be frozen. He looked at her, at the woman he had once loved deeply, and laughed coldly. Are the words you've said, the feelings you've given, are they all fake? He had never been so humble before. This woman had clearly made her choice, but he still wanted to save her. Liangqiu raised her head and said in a choked voice, Anlin, it was true in the past, and it will be true in the present and in the future. Anlin, I don't have a way, I don't have a way. If I had a way, I wouldn't have let you be sad and desperate. Qin Pei is still in Su Shirqing's hands. As long as I say a word, he will immediately be killed. Anlin, I'm sorry. I know it's very difficult, but I still have to do it, even if I have to pay a price 100 times worse than I imagined. Qin Anlin suddenly laughed. He lit a cigarette and looked at her through the smoke. What about the child? Are you going to give birth to her in prison? Her lips trembled slightly as she looked at him. Chapter 1582. Liangqiu closed her eyes. Anlin, will you really let me go to jail? I don't believe you. She sighed. Qin Anlin held one of her hands and raised it high. He looked at her and said coldly, You don't believe me? Liangqiu, we could try. Her hand hurt from his grip. When she opened her eyes were filled with tears, as though stars had fallen from the sky. However, he didn't want to see those eyes again. He let go of her hand and got up slowly. With a bitter smile, he said, Let's do it this way. Liangqiu. He wanted to go out, but he paused. I'll get my lawyer to file a lawsuit. If you want to go to jail, then I'll think of a comfortable environment for you like I'm. I'll pick you up after you give birth to the child. With that, he paused. After a long time, he continued, But it's impossible for us. He stood ramrod straight, his silhouette completely desolate. Liangqiu looked at his back view. He suddenly turned around and looked at her. Liangqiu, why did you provoke me? Since you said you loved me, why did you give up? After my heart was filled with you, you cruelly told me that I wasn't the most important and cruelly forced me to let go of your hand. He didn't want an answer from her. He didn't want to say it to her. Their eyes met. After a while, he didn't say anything else and walked out. The door of the detention center closed with a squeak. When he shut the last ray of sunlight outside, she couldn't hold back her tears any longer. He said, Liangqiu, it's impossible for us to be together. He said, Why did you provoke me? Liangqiu, this is the outcome you've already thought of. Why do you still feel so upset? Autumn went and autumn came. Liangqiu's trial was 2 months later. She was already 6 months pregnant. She stood in court with a huge belly. Qin Anlin was sitting on the plaintiff's side, looking at her expressionlessly. He looked at her inconvenience, almost like she was clumsy. His heart ached. He had never wanted her to go to jail. He was just forcing her to tell the truth. Liangqiu placed her hand on her abdomen. While she was in the detention center, she still had regular prenatal checkups. The child in her belly was still doing well, but something unexpected happened. When her defense lawyer came over, Qin Anlin was shocked. Lu Jinyun. 10 years ago, he developed his career in the United States. Later, he returned to be city and opened a law firm. He was one of the top lawyers in the country. He cherished his reputation very much and generally did not appear in such criminal cases. Yi Liangxiu could not invite him. It was even more impossible for Su Shurchen. Qin Anlin's mood was very complicated, but he was still calm. Keim whispered, "I've checked." It was Mr. Tang who asked Lawyer Liu to come out. "Tang you?" Qin Anlin's gaze fell on Yi Liangxiu's face again. Yi Liangxiu pursed her lips and did not say anything. Keim whispered again, "If President Qin is not confident, you can apply to postpone the trial." He was just testing the waters. It was not his original intention. Qin Anlin said calmly, "There's no need for that." Keim heaved a sigh of relief. He looked at Yi Liangxiu with mixed feelings. With Lu Jinyun's help, the case became much easier to argue. Everyone in the courtroom had witnessed his various methods. Yi Liangxiu was sued, but because there was insufficient evidence, she was released on the spot. Chapter 1583. He didn't understand why Tang Yu wanted to help Yi Liangxiu. When Yi Liangxiu walked out of the courtroom, she looked at Lu Jinyun and said softly, "Thank you, Lawyer Liu. Actually, I'm very expensive. Mr. Tang paid me 50 million yuan to fight this case and get you out of prison." Lu Jinyun said bluntly. Yi Liangxiu was stunned. Lawyer Liu had never said that before. Lu Jinyun smiled slightly. "Mr. Tang's wife is in the car in front. You can ask them about the details." In the end, he reached out his hand. "Anyway, I still congratulate you on regaining your freedom." Lu Jinyun was 35 years old. He was gentle and elegant. He was a famous bachelor in B City. He had a good reputation and had no bad records. He turned around and opened his car door. Suddenly, he turned around and looked at her. "Miss Yi, I like your movie very much." After saying that, he opened the white Bentley and got into the car. Yi Liangxiu didn't understand why he said that to her. She also didn't know that Lu Jinyun took this case not only because of Tang Yu, but also because he was her fan. She watched his car drive away with a profound look in her eyes. After a long time, she turned around and saw a black Rolls-Royce Phantom. The door opened and Pei Chi-Chi got out of the car. She held the door with one hand to prevent her head from hitting it. Yi Liangxiu's eyes were a little hot. She watched Tang Yu get out of the car. "Thank you, Mr. Tang." She looked at him, and then her eyes fell on Pei Chi-Chi's face. She knew that they had also gone through a lot of hardships to be together. Would her Anlin have such a day? Would she be able to return to Anlin in the future? Would she be able to lie under his body and bear his love? She didn't know, and she didn't dare to think about it. Tang Yu nodded. He looked at her, then looked at Qin Anlin, who walked out of the courtroom. Then he instructed Pei Chi-Chi, "Chi-Chi, take her to Xia City first." Yi Liangxiu looked up and saw Qin Anlin over there. Pei Chi-Chi gently pulled her. "Let's go. Anlin looks like he wants to eat someone." Tang Yu looked at his wife helplessly and said, "Miss Yi, leave with Chi-Chi first." Yi Liangxiu got into the car in a daze. The black limousine started slowly and she saw Anlin. However, the car soon left and could not be seen. She was a little worried. "Will Mr. Tang be in trouble?" Pei Chi-Chi casually said, "I won't." She secretly stuck out her tongue. At most, it would be a fight. After all, they had fought many times. In fact, some words were not easy to say. It seemed that Tang Yu helped Yi Liangxiu on the surface, but in fact, it was Qin Anlin who let her go. If Anlin didn't love her and was cruel, then Liangxiu couldn't stand the torture. Everyone knew this. It was just that Liangxiu didn't know it, and Anlin didn't want to admit it. On the other side, Qin Anlin stepped forward and gave Tang Yu a punch. Tang Yu took such a blow to vent his anger. He took a few steps back, straightened his body, and wiped the corner of his mouth. It was bleeding. What a hard punch. "Why did you do this?" Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes. "You knew that my mother's death had something to do with Mr. Su." Chapter 1584. How do you know that I want to let her go? Qin Anlin's face was full of coldness. "Tang Yu, get out of my way. Don't block my way. or I won't let you go either. Tang Yu was wearing home clothes, as if he had just crawled out of bed at home. His voice was indifferent. I'm right here. If you don't want to let me go, then hurry up. Even Qin Anlin, who knew Tang Yu so well, had never thought that Tang Yu would become so shameless. He clasped his hands. It seems that we can only talk with our fists. Tang Yu held his chin with his fingers and frowned. I really don't like such a violent method. He took 2 steps back and clenched his fists. But if you like, we can still do some exercise together. Qin Anlin was a little confused. At this time, the most serious Tang Yu had become delusional. Thus, the two of them fought for the 3rd time. The first 2 fights were for Pei Qi, and this time, it was for Yi Liangqiu. Tang Yu was mainly in defense. As long as his handsome face wasn't hit, it would be fine. That face could seduce his little Qi at any time. If it was ruined, what would he use to attract her? Qin Anlin's fists hit flesh. In the end, he probably realized that Tang Yu wanted to let him win. His eyes were red, and he stopped. Tang Yu, you don't have to do this. If you want to make me feel better, don't interfere between me and Yi Liangqiu. His voice was cold. It's impossible for me and her to be together in this lifetime. How could he not know what Tang Yu was thinking? Tang Yu saved Liangqiu just to give them one last chance. One last chance to be together. If Liangqiu was in jail, it would be impossible for them. Tang Yu stood up slowly and sighed slightly. He walked over and patted his shoulder. Anlin, since you know it clearly, why do you still insist on treating her like this? They clearly still had feelings for each other. Qin Anlin took out a cigarette and lit it. After taking a puff, he looked at Tang Yu faintly. If it were you, how would you treat Qi? This was exactly what Tang Yu could not answer. After a long time, he sighed and said, Anlin, I believe that she will not betray you. But she did it. Qin Anlin sneered. Tang Yu, what can I do? Take her back and continue to be a loving couple? How can I face my mother? Tang Yu wanted to say something, but Qin Anlin had already punched Tang Yu's lower abdomen. It was so painful that he broke out in a cold sweat. You're so ruthless. Tang Yu bent over, and his forehead was full of cold sweat. He felt that he was about to be crippled. His married life with Qi was probably going to be ruined. And Qin Anlin had already gotten in the car and drove away quickly. He knew very well where Tang Yu would take Yi Liangqiu. It must be Xia City. Half an hour later, he appeared at the gate of Xia City. It was Pei Qi who opened the door. She looked at the person and opened her mouth slightly in surprise. Anlin. Then she instinctively wanted to close the door, but it was too late. Qin Anlin had already pushed her away. Get out of the way. Where's Yi Liangqiu? Pei Qi bumped into the door, and her little nose was almost flattened, but she immediately ran over to stop him. Anlin, calm down. Get out of the way, Qin Anlin said coldly. He was not polite to her. Pei Qi pursed her lips. No way. Qin Anlin, she is now 6 months pregnant. You can't do this to her. Qin Anlin smiled coldly. She doesn't even care about the child. Chapter 1585. Pei Qi hugged his waist from behind and hung on him like a little monkey, looking a little ridiculous. Qin Anlin paused and said in a deep voice, Let go of Qi. I'm not letting go, she said roguishly, still hugging his waist and burying her face in his back. She hurriedly said, Anlin, did you forget how much you loved her in the past? Did you forget how you two started? In order to give birth to Muyun, she lived in the south for so many years? Feeling his body soften a little and not as stiff as before, she mumbled, Anlin, have you forgotten all of that? Qi, let go. Qin Anlin's voice was hoarse. I wouldn't be like this today if I forgot. Yi Liangqiu would have died 100 times over. Pei Qi was still hugging him tightly. Then what are you going to do to her? Did you kill her? She ran in front of him and stopped him. Don't forget that she's pregnant with your child. Qin Anlin stared at her and said, Qi, don't interfere in my business with her. I don't care. I just want to interfere. Pei Qi's eyes were watery. Anlin, I know you're sad, but I'm more afraid that you'll regret it in the future, she said with a choked voice. I don't care about you. Who cares about you? She actually started crying like a child. She had feelings for him after living in New York for 2 years. Although they weren't husband and wife, He was like her brother. She felt guilty that he sent her back to Tang Yu's side in one piece. Fortunately, he was also happy. But now, he was destroying that happiness. Liangqiu loved him more than anyone else. It was hatred that blinded his eyes, making him unable to see himself and Liangqiu's heart clearly. Anlin. She hugged him like an octopus. Qin Anlin's heart was also heavy. He lowered his head, looked at her, and smiled bitterly. Chi-Chi, you're not me. You can't understand how I feel. Understand? She looked up at him. I'm the same as Liangqiu. I've done terrible things and hurt others. Anlin, if she's really like what you think, she just cares and doesn't want to see that person's last days in prison. Anlin, if that person is going to die, you can use other methods, can't you? Pei Chi-Chi was afraid that he would go to the room to look for Yi Liangqiu again, so she simply hooked her legs around him, not giving him a chance to move. This kind of attitude was really inelegant, but she couldn't care less. Qin Anlin's gaze lowered. Then, he decisively plucked the little person from his arms and threw her on the sofa. When she bounced up, he quickly tore off his tie and tied her feet, then threw her on the sofa. Qin Anlin, don't go in, you'll regret it. Pei Chi-Chi lay there pathetically, and her voice was the same. Also, this is my home. My home. But Qin Anlin ignored her and directly opened the door to the master bedroom. Because the soundproofing was too good, Yi Liangqiu, who was showering in the master bedroom, didn't know that he had come. So when he suddenly opened the bathroom door, both of them were stunned. Her 6-month-old belly was so big that it looked like it was going to be full term. She stood there, the light shining on her body, making her pregnant body look even more holy. Chapter 1586. His eyes were burning as he stared at her, and didn't say a word for a long time. Yi Liangqiu quickly grabbed a large towel and wrapped it around himself. His body retreated until he was pressed against the cold wall. His voice was suppressed as he said, "Put on your clothes." She still didn't say anything and just looked at his face as if a storm was brewing. Qin Anlin's Adam's apple bobbed as he walked forward step by step. Her body was against the wall, and her red lips were trembling slightly. His gaze was fixed on her body. Although her stomach was big, she was thin and her legs were too thin. She looked like a frog, but she was still seductive. Finally, his palm touched her stomach, and he said in a hoarse voice, "Where are the clothes?" She shook her head and wanted to scream, but she couldn't say a word. Qin Anlin looked around and finally didn't care. He took Tang Yu's shirt and coat from the changing room and put it on her. This action of his caused Yi Liangqiu's heart to sink completely. A man letting his woman wear another man's clothes meant that he didn't care anymore. He really didn't want her anymore and hated her. She didn't resist anymore and let him put it on for her. There wasn't even a trace of life in her eyes. "Let's go." He held her hand without pity and walked towards the door. His pace was not slow. It was difficult for a pregnant woman who was 6 months pregnant, but it was obvious that he didn't care anymore. When they passed by the living room, Pei Chi-Chi was still lying on the ground and crying. "Anlin, let go of her. If you want to take her, take me. I'll help you get rid of that old bastard." Qin Anlin stopped in his tracks, and Yi Liangqiu was forced to stop as well. She fell into his arms due to inertia, and his long-lost scent enveloped him. His gaze fell on Pei Chi-Chi's face, and he just smiled coldly. "Pei Chi-Chi, you've grown up." As he spoke, he lowered his head and glanced at Yi Liangqiu. His eyes were cold as if they had been frozen. Yi Liangqiu said faintly, "Let go of her. Worry more about yourself. Tang will be back in a while." The latter words were directed at Pei Chi-Chi. As he spoke, he walked towards the door. Yi Liangqiu was almost dragged away by him. Pei Chi-Chi's sadness was all fed to the dogs. She scolded, "Qin Anlin, you bastard. You deserve to be single for the rest of your life. That's your wife. She's pregnant with your son." But what answered her was the sound of a door being slammed. Pei Chi-Chi started crying again. Wow, let me go. I need to go to the bathroom." In less than 5 minutes, Tang Yu opened the door, walked over quickly, picked her up, and untied her tie. "Where's Yi Liangqiu?" Anlin took her away. Pei Chi-Chi cried out and hugged her husband. "Tang Yu, Liang Qiu is so pitiful. Can you bring her back? Tang Yu felt that the little girl in his arms was so soft. Ever since she fell into the water and lost her memory, she had been like this. Actually, she had remembered, but her personality had always been like this. She didn't look like she was 27 or 28 years old. She seemed even younger than when he first met her. However, he was willing to dote on her and let her have her way. If it were any other time, he would have doted on her and hugged her. But now he had something else on his mind. Chapter 1587. Tang Yu patted her. I think there must be something troubling you, Liang Qiu, and she can't tell anyone about it. Pei Chi looked at her husband, her big eyes full of admiration. And then, there's nothing else. He reached out and rubbed her little feet. It's so hard to talk to a little fool like you. I think she's being threatened, a threat that even Amlin can't solve. He suddenly said, Chi, do you believe in Liang Qiu? Oh, Pei Chi replied ambiguously. Liang Qiu is one of the few women I admire. He rubbed his little wife's little head lovingly. Pei Chi had recently realized that whenever Tang Yu showed such a loving expression, it meant that he wanted to dote on her. But she wasn't in the mood now. She knelt in front of him and didn't care about letting him rub her feet. She asked eagerly, Who else do you admire? Tang Yu was amused. He reached out and touched his handsome chin. My mother. Who else? Pei Chi's eyes were twinkling. She couldn't be jealous of her mother-in-law. Tang Yu pretended to be troubled. What else? I don't think so. Pei Chi grumbled unhappily. That's all? Aren't there any outstanding women around you? Around me? Tang Yu thought for a moment. Being careful isn't bad. Pei Chi was furious. What about me? What about me? What about me? Aren't you going to consider me? Tang Yu reached out and pinched her little face. You don't need to be outstanding, because no matter what you are, I like you. Liking is not admiring, and she didn't need other men to admire her. It was enough as long as he liked her. This was considered his best sweet talk, but Pei Chi took a long time to understand it. Then, she blushed slightly and pouted. That's more like it. He picked her up and walked to the bedroom. She didn't know what he wanted to do before, but now she knew. Pei Chi was furious. I have to save Liang Qiu. I'm only responsible for keeping her out of jail. I think she has her own plans in the future. Under my protection, she and Amlin will never be able to be together. Tang Yu reached out to touch her lips. Now, Chi, don't speak. Pei Chi shouted. Anyway, I will never call you brother again today. This pervert. Every time he did this kind of thing, he would force her to call him brother. After that, she thought that he would let her go. Who knew that it was as if he was on steroids? She would not be fooled. All right, don't call me brother, call me daddy. He smiled. While Xiaoxin isn't around, Chi, do whatever you want. He had hit the nail on the head. Pei Chi bit her lips. I don't want to. But after a while, she climbed into his arms. Before the feast, she still asked worriedly, Amlin won't do anything to Liang Qiu, right? Pei Chi, instead of worrying about others, you should worry about yourself. Tang Yu sealed her little mouth and ended the topic. He didn't tell his Chi that he had deliberately let Amlin take Liang Qiu away. Otherwise, with Amlin's skills, he wouldn't be able to touch him at all. Pei Chi was a little dazzled by his kiss. Her little hand hung around his neck. Will you help Liang Qiu then? Tang Yu smiled. He could predict what would happen in the future. He sighed. Probably Amlin will end our friendship. You have a friendship with him? Pei Chi looked at him in disdain. Chapter 1588. Qin Amlin threw Yi Liang Qiu into the back seat of the car. When she was about to escape, he held the car door with his hand, bent over, and looked straight at her. If you don't want to lose your child, you'd better not think about escaping. With that, he slammed the door and got into the car himself. When he buckled the seatbelt, Yi Liang Qiu's voice was a little soft. Where are we going? Her voice was trembling because of nervousness. Qin Amlin's voice was very slow. Just now, Pei Chi said that there's another way, which is for me to kill Su Shurching myself. I think this idea is very good. No, Yi Liangqiu's voice had a hint of surprise in it. Anlin, don't. Once he did that, Anlin's father would probably be dead before Su Shicheng died. Su Shicheng hid Qin Pei very well, and no one knew where he was. So for so many years, no one knew that Qin Pei was imprisoned in City B. Qin Anlin put his hands on the steering wheel and smiled coldly. Why? Can't bear to part with him? His voice was very cold. Yi Liangqiu, but I insisted on doing this. The high-performance sports car started and sped up at the fastest speed. Yi Liangqiu sat there, her face a little pale. She held the armrest with her hand and closed her eyes. This was their reunion after a long time, and it was very painful. She couldn't stop what he wanted to do, but she didn't expect that Qin Anlin wasn't alone. Soon, she saw about 5 or 6 black business cars following their car in the rearview mirror. She panted lightly as she looked at Qin Anlin's back. Anlin, what do you want to do? He had been prepared. There was a realization that almost made her breathless. He knew that she wouldn't go to jail, and he had long wanted to solve it in this way. Qin Anlin's car suddenly slowed down by the street. She seemed to have realized something. Panting, she looked at him. Anlin, don't go. Qin Anlin sat quietly for a while and said calmly, Liangqiu, our fate is over. I might not be able to fulfill my promise to you at the wedding. He paused. But Su Shicheng, I must kill him. If I don't come back, take good care of Mu Yun. It was the first time in months that he had spoken to her so gently, as if she were still his wife. But when she heard it, she felt even sadder. This was his farewell to her, a matter of life and death. Yi Liangqiu shook her head. Don't go, Anlin. Then, will you tell the truth? Let the law punish Su Shicheng? He turned slightly and looked at her calmly. Yi Liangqiu shook her head. Anlin, it's not like that. It's not that simple. Tell me why. He was giving her one last chance. He told her in his heart. Yi Liangqiu was stunned. She knew what he was thinking, but she couldn't. If she told the truth, it would definitely lead to Lady Qin's humiliation, not to mention Qin Pei's life. She was silent for a long time before saying softly, Anlin, I'm begging you. He doesn't have many years left. God will deal with him. But I'd rather do it myself. Qin Anlin's voice became cold. Then he opened the car door and got out, opening the door for her. Yi Liangqiu was brought out of the car by him. Kang got out of the car by the side. Qin Anlin handed Yi Liangqiu to him. Come, look after her. He only trusted Kime. Chapter 1589. Kime knew very well how important Yi Liangqiu was in President Qin's heart. Even after such a big thing happened, Chairman Qin still couldn't let it go. He said heartless words and even made Yi Liangqiu suffer a lot. However, when it came to life and death, he still couldn't bear it. Kime nodded. Miss Yi, I'll send you away. In fact, President Qin had already written his will. No one knew if he would live or die this time. He felt a little tragic, but he also understood President Qin's actions. If he pretended that nothing had happened, then he didn't deserve to be a child. Yi Liangqiu struggled with all her might, but Kime used some strength. Miss Yi, don't forget that you're pregnant. I don't want to hurt you or the child. Yi Liangqiu watched Qin Anlin get into the car in a daze. He left decisively. Other than what he had told Mu Yun, he didn't say anything else. She was held back by Kime, and tears were already flowing. She had shed all the tears in her life over the past few months. She just looked at his back and mumbled, no, no. She had thought that things wouldn't be so bad if he brought her along, but Anlin was going there with the intention of fighting to the death. No, she had to stop him. Qin Anlin's fingers were on the car door. He paused for a moment, then suddenly turned around and looked at her with his deep eyes. Liangqiu, if your daughter is born, let her surname be Yi. No, Anlin, no. She kept shaking her head as she was held back by Kime. Qin Anlin just looked at her deeply, then got into the car and left quickly. The cars followed closely behind. Yi Liangqiu's tears didn't stop, and she let out a heart-wrenching cry. Su Shicheng wasn't easy to deal with, or he had already expected it. Kime, he'll be in danger. Yi Liangqiu's voice trembled. Take me there, take me there. I want to stop everything. Kime sighed. Miss Yi, President Qin asked me to send you away. She was stunned. Go south. Keim's voice was filled with helplessness. Including Mu Yun. President Qin has already arranged for someone to send him there. Yi Liangqiu was stunned. All of this was well thought out. He had planned it all out. However, she felt that something was strange. Suddenly, her phone rang. It was a message. As soon as she opened it, her face turned pale. Keim, I'm sorry, she muttered, then threw the phone at the back of Keim's head. Keim's eyes widened as he stared at her in disbelief. Then, his body slumped to the ground. Yi Liangqiu took the car keys from his hand, put her hand on her stomach, and quickly got into the car. Her abdomen hurt a little, but she could only endure it. She reversed the car and drove towards the Su residence. At the Su residence, the two sides were facing each other. Qin Anlin's men surrounded the Su residence. Su Shicheng was helped down from the second floor by the housekeeper. He covered his chest and coughed violently. He was wearing home clothes, and he walked down slowly like an old man who didn't care about worldly affairs. Anlin, what are you doing? Are you going to massacre the Su residents? He went downstairs and was 5 steps away from Qin Anlin, looking calm. Qin Anlin raised his gun at him. How did my mother die? Su Shicheng smiled. You have to ask Liangqiu. She brought Hong Ke back, didn't she? I'm asking you now. Qin Anlin gritted his teeth. Su Shicheng, do you dare say that you've never seen my mother? Chapter 1590. It's not a doubt, it's a certainty, Qin Anlin said coldly. Since you don't want to say it, then maybe you will tell the truth to the gun in my hand after you die. The gun in his hand was loaded, and the crisp sound was exceptionally clear. However, Su Shicheng still smiled calmly looking around. Anlin, bringing 20 to 30 people like this to bully a lonely old man doesn't seem to be a bit justifiable. Su Shicheng wasn't armed at all. He just stood there by himself, looking fearless. I don't want to talk nonsense. Qin Anlin sneered, Su Shicheng goodbye. But when he pulled the trigger, a person quickly rushed out and pushed Su Shicheng away. The bullet pierced through her palm. Blood splattered and dyed everyone's eyes red. That person was Yi Liangqiu. Her body retreated a few steps and was finally caught by the housekeeper beside Su Shicheng. Blood kept flowing from her hand, but she still did not pass out. She looked at Qin Anlin, who raised the gun again. Anlin, don't shoot. Just now, a picture came from her mobile phone. Qingxiu and Mu Yin were at the airport. However, not far away, there were 2 black-clothed men clearly following them. She believed that if something happened to Su Shicheng, then Mu Yun, she would never see Mu Yun again. She hated Su Shicheng, but she had to save him. She used the stupidest method, because if Qin Anlin still loved her, then only her blood could stop him. Qin Anlin's eyes were bloodshot, and he looked at her, looking at her palm that was shot. That blood made his heart ache and also made him angry. Liangqiu, get out of the way. I'll kill him and take you to the hospital. Then everything will be over. His voice was cold. He told himself not to be soft-hearted. Yi Liangqiu felt a pain in her lower abdomen, and her palm was in so much pain that she almost lost feeling. Drop by drop, the blood dripped onto the floor and finally converged into a straight line. She pushed away the person who was supporting her and stood in front of Su Shicheng. She smiled bitterly. Anlin, I beg you, let him go. Qin Anlin's Adam's apple kept moving, and his eyes were bloodshot. He stared at her and shouted hoarsely, Move, or I'll shoot. She stood there with her big belly. Her long hair had long been scattered, and she was wearing clothes that did not fit her body. She was in a very sorry state, but there was a kind of despairing beauty. Her beauty made his eyes tinged with a layer of pain. Are you forcing me? He narrowed his eyes, looked at her, gritted his teeth, and said word by word. Yi Liangqiu's pupils suddenly shrank, and her mouth heaved up and down violently. Yes. He closed his eyes. Yi Liangqiu, do you have a heart? He pulled the trigger on the gun in his hand. With a bang, a hole was punched through the ceiling. Everyone was shocked, including Yi Liangqiu. Qin Anlin looked at her and smiled pitifully. Yi Liangqiu, you win. He slowly lowered his hand that was raised high, He turned around and walked toward the door. As he walked, he said calmly, "Next time, I won't be merciful." He did not care about her life or death. Su Shurcheng would not let her die. He even pointed at Yu Liangxiu to take the bullet for him. As Qin Anlin thought about it, he laughed self-deprecatingly. How silly. Since when did he trust a woman? Yu Liangxiu looked at his back view, so bleak and lonely. You're tuning into the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.